Hello, this is Elizabeth, and welcome back to Root of Ramose, a poetry series in which we observe the mechanics, aesthetics, and meaning of the greatest founding texts of the Western poetic tradition. Today, we are continuing our textual analysis of the Epic of Gilgamesh by looking at Tablet 9, in which our protagonist, Gilgamesh, is plagued by the fear of death, is confronted by the guardians of the Mashu twin mountains, and then must undergo a trial of darkness before reaching the Garden of Precious Stones. As always, this analysis is done with the hope of better understanding the root of poetic traditions, and to consider how to intentionally reincorporate observed conventions of verse into modern-day poetry. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started. In the first section of this tablet, the main narrative conflict is revealed. In lines 3 and 4, we see that Gilgamesh has realized his fate, that he will die like Enkidu. Given that Gilgamesh is a demigod, it's understandable that he may have been under the impression that he would be able to have a spiritual fate different from full-fledged mortals. Due to the fact that Enkidu was made in the image of Gilgamesh, as we see in the creation of Enkidu Tablet 1, line 94 through 112. It's fair to argue that the death of his friend was a kind of ego death for Gilgamesh. This newfound understanding of his own mortality is pivotal for his character change, and further compels him on his journey. Lines 5 and 6 explain what Gilgamesh intends to do about his fear of death. He is going to find Utnapishti. If you recall from Tablet 1, we can see who Utnapishti is. We know that this character was mortal, but then gained wisdom and acquired immortality during the Great Flood, and this was of course referenced in Tablet 1, line 41 to 44. Lines 15 and 16 include a reference to both an axe and a dirk. By extension, when considering the lines of mourning in the previous tablet, it's also reasonable to consider this a reference to Enkidu, and the vitality still exercised by Gilgamesh. This strong will is secured to Gilgamesh only after prayer is given to the moon. The eternal conflict between Gilgamesh's composite nature as both human and divine is shown in Gilgamesh's behavior when he encounters lions in the wild. We see that he is fearful. This contrasts greatly against his personality in prior tablets. He went from a fearless, bold warrior king in Tablet 2, line 300, also in Tablet 4, line 250, and Tablet 6, line 145. And he goes from those instances of exercising courage to then now cowering and providing supplications to a deity for his safe passage in the wilderness. He then goes to sleep before he finally takes action to kill the lion, so he's showing a very great change in the way that he approaches problems. There are then further details given regarding Gilgamesh's behavior, which becomes sporadic. That starts in the Sipar supplemental tablets. Overall, the gaps of association and logic between his actions becomes wider, so much so that it's difficult to discern the purpose behind his actions. It's really unclear as to why he's digging wells and then chasing the wind, other than to show that he's gone insane, maybe. Another reason why I think the text is illustrating the irrational state of Gilgamesh is because of how Shamash responds in the next few lines, showing that he is growing worried and bending down to Gilgamesh before asking a very blunt question. "O Gilgamesh, where are you wandering? The life that you seek you never will find." The response provided next is seen in lines Sipar 9 through 15 and is composed of very beautiful verse regarding existential dread. There is a use of primordial symbols to address the eternal question of life and death by using light and darkness. He's questioning how long he has yet to live, and also how long he will experience death. Is there a possibility that the dead will one day be rebirthed? This may be in reference to a major restructuring of the cosmic order of heaven, earth, and the netherworld, or it may just be a question of when he will personally be resurrected from the dead. Regardless, it's clear to us that the fear of death is now the motivating force behind our protagonist's journey, and that he is desperately seeking a way to circumvent death. We see Gilgamesh continuing on his journey now, and he reaches the Mashu Twin Mountains. The text illustrates how the material plane is placed in relation to both heaven and the netherworld. Here, we see that the material supports heaven. Given that the netherworld is at the base of the mountain, this line could also be suggesting that in some way the netherworld also assists in supporting heaven. It makes sense that the mountains here are being used as a literal gate to divinity, as this is a symbol that has continually embedded itself in mythology as well as revolving around notions of mysticism and levels of spiritual stratification. Next, we see scorpion men are found guarding its gates. It's interesting they're described in a similar manner as Humbaba. Initially, Gilgamesh is fearful, but quickly recovers his composure. Right away, they recognize Gilgamesh's nature as being composed of 2/3 god and 1/3 human. They spend some time questioning him about his journey. It is difficult to know the explicit details about their dialogue because of the missing lines. However, we can see that within the 35-line gap, Gilgamesh was able to ingratiate himself with the Scorpion Men. This is another instance in which we are given evidence of the character change of Gilgamesh, because he chooses to reason with the Guardians rather than to test his might against them. Still, it is curious how he was able to convince them to let him pass. Line 130 might be related to how Gilgamesh was able to gain favor with the guards. We see them refer to him as having flesh of the gods, which is a characterization revolving particularly around his divine nature. Obviously, this would matter to the Scorpion Men because they are guardians that serve the divine. It does seem reasonable that Gilgamesh used his nature as an appeal regarding why this should allow him to pass through the gate and carry on with his journey. Given that Gilgamesh is the first of his kind, there is no supreme precedence that has been established regarding his existential fate, in which case his mixed identity allows him to operate outside of the normal conditions for mortals seeking immortality through divine knowledge. And so the Scorpion Men wish Gilgamesh well on his journey, and it eases him forward to the next stage. Next, we have the sequence within the tablet in which Gilgamesh is racing against time in order to reach the edge of the world. As he travels, he is engulfed in darkness where no light is present. Now, there is a reference to double hours in this section, and it's very mysterious. It's not clear what this term means. It could be that Gilgamesh is traveling in a domain where time unfolds differently. Like, maybe for every hour he travels, it's like he's crossing over a time zone and it doubles his time. Or it could mean that for each hour, he must travel that same duration twice. If that were the case, he would be traveling for 156 hours non-stop, which would come out to 6.5 days. Whatever it is that the double hour is referring to, we know that Gilgamesh is racing against time, as explained in the synopsis displayed at the beginning of the tablet. While the section between lines 139 and 166 is almost entirely the same stanza repeated for each double hour he travels, there are still some details to touch on regarding the repetitive nature of the lines. First, this repetition, stanza after stanza, is used to demonstrate the tiring length and seemingly unchanging nature of the journey. With that, consider how terrifying it would be to spend such a long duration of time walking in complete darkness for hours. Most likely, Gilgamesh was unable to keep track of time and could only continue to move forward. This part of the journey would greatly test the will of the individual, away from any divine influence. This passage through darkness would be a passage made in complete isolation, without any distraction. There isn't even mention of sound, so it's possible that this passage through darkness is also taking place through complete silence. The last detail that is interesting to take note of in this section is that the darkness is actually personified when it states, "It did not allow him to see behind him." This further shows that Gilgamesh is being tested by an entity known as the darkness. At last, the repetition is altered ever so slightly at the 8th double hour, where Gilgamesh is now hurrying. Then, at the 9th double hour, there is a reference to the north wind. Upon the 10th double hour, the repetition ends for the remaining double hours journey of 11 and 12. When Gilgamesh reaches the next stage of his journey, he sees beautiful trees that grow precious stones like carnelian and lapis lazuli and more. The tablet concludes with Gilgamesh observing the garden of jewels, and there is a mention of someone watching him. So we can assume that Gilgamesh is now in the presence of some goddess. So some final takeaways regarding Tablet 9 is that it really illustrates nonstop conflict for Gilgamesh. We can see from the first stanza how the state of his being has entirely changed since the death of Enkidu and the newfound knowledge of his own mortality. Really, this fear that he now holds enters into his decision-making and ultimately makes him more cautious. On top of that, it seems at one point he is completely consumed by grief of knowing about his own mortality. This is important because it helps the audience to understand the narrative stakes of his journey. The knowledge of mortality has transformed Gilgamesh and has humanized his character. Existential dread is something we all eventually face. Of course, there are certainly layers of understanding that occurs to one's perception of death over time. Ultimately, this dread and grief that Gilgamesh feels is something that many can sympathize with, and all ought to be able to understand. This core conflict is what enables us to be emotionally invested in the remaining tablets of the narrative, and I think the embodiment of the most universal existential conflict is what makes this epic so substantial and relevant even to a modern audience. When we move forward with analyzing other epics, it will be interesting to see the parallels in subject matter, and consider how this epic was able to influence later epics crafted within the Western canon. That's all I have to share for today. We now have just 2 more tablets until the end of this epic. As always, if you have any questions or comments about the text, feel free to comment down below. Until next time, take care.